December 11th, 1941. Berlin, Reich Chancellery. Snow drifted in slow, ghostly spirals across Wilhelmstrasse as a convoy of staff cars hissed to a stop outside the Chancellery. Officers slammed their doors, boots crunching through frost, breath steaming in the bitter cold. Inside the marble corridors, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and something else. Unease. In a second-floor office lined with maps and red telephone wires, Colonel Gerhard Engel, one of Hitler's military adjutants, stood by a frost-rimmed window, listening to distant traffic echo off the stone buildings. His gloved hands tightened around a folder as shouting erupted behind a closed door. Hitler was awake, and he was furious. "Roosevelt has pushed us too far." The voice inside was raw, shaking with rage. "The Americans shoot at our U-boats, supply our enemies, act as if they are already at war. Then so be it. They shall have their war." Engel exchanged a look with General Jodel's aide across the hall. Neither spoke, but both understood the madness in that sentence. Germany was already drowning in commitments. 500,000 men frozen outside Moscow, the Africa Corps starved of fuel, shipyards struggling to replace the losses in the Atlantic, and now, this? The door burst open. Hitler swept out, pale, eyes burning, his uniform rumpled as if he'd been pacing for hours. "Summon Ribbentrop," he barked. "We will address the Reichstag, today." Engel followed at a distance as Hitler marched down the corridor toward the main hall, 2 SS guards trailing like shadows. The Führer's voice rose again, almost feverish. "America is decadent, corrupt, a mongrel nation incapable of true war. Their factories are soft, their people softer. They will crumble like Britain once we strike." Engel swallowed hard. Soft? He thought of the photographs he'd seen. Endless lines of smokestacks in Detroit, assembly lines in California, producing aircraft faster than Germany could count them. And the latest intelligence reports whispered numbers that made the Wehrmacht staff pale. 3 million men under arms, 10,000 aircraft, shipyards that produced more steel than the entire Axis combined. But Hitler didn't want numbers. He wanted enemies. At 1 p.m., in the cold cavern of the Kroll Opera House, the Reichstag assembled. Rows of German officers, ministers, and Nazi officials sat rigidly in their seats as Hitler strode to the podium. Engel stood behind the curtains, close enough to see sweat bead on Hitler's brow. The room fell silent. Hitler gripped the lectern, his knuckles white. "The President of the United States has committed unprovoked acts of aggression against Germany," he declared, voice booming through the chamber. "We therefore consider ourselves at war with the United States of America." Applause erupted, orchestrated, hollow, dutiful. The impact hit Engel like a punch. That was it. A single sentence, delivered in a half-lit hall in a corner of Germany, had just changed the fate of millions. Outside, the city's loudspeakers blared the news. Civilians gathered on street corners, some cheering, others too numb to react. A factory worker paused mid-stride, cigarette in hand. "America?" he muttered. "Why in God's name would we fight America too?" He never got an answer. Back inside the Chancellery, Engel returned to the operations room, where General Jodl stood over a map of the world. Red pins marked Germany's enemies: Britain, the Soviet Union, dozens of Allied colonies. Now a new pin, bright and crimson, was pressed into North America. Jodl sighed. "This is a global war now," he said quietly, "and we have just opened the gates of hell." Across the Atlantic, the United States heard the news with disbelief. In Washington, Roosevelt stopped reading the memo halfway through and whispered, He declared war on us? Even the president hadn't expected that. Congress didn't debate. They didn't argue. They didn't hesitate. The vote for war against Germany passed in minutes. In Detroit, workers on the night shift gathered around radios. In Norfolk, shipyard whistles blew as men rushed to their stations. In California, pilots scrambled toward newly built aircraft lined wing to wing across sun-baked runways. And in Berlin, Engel pressed a hand against the cold window pane, watching snow continue to fall on the capital. Hitler believed America was weak, fractured, unserious, a nation incapable of fighting across oceans. Engel knew better. He had seen the reports. He understood the truth. Germany had just declared war on an industrial giant capable of building more planes, tanks, and ships than any nation in human history. And the gates of hell had indeed been opened. From the inside. January 5th, 1942. Wolfschanz, Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. A blizzard hammered the pine forests around Hitler's headquarters, the snow swallowing sound and light alike. Inside the reinforced timber bunker, however, the air was oven hot. Maps covered every wall, radios crackled with broken signals from the Eastern Front, and the smell of cigarettes clung to every uniform. Colonel Gerhard Engel stepped into the conference room just as a heated argument erupted between Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Armaments Minister Albert Speer. "Mein Führer," Keitel insisted, desperate. "Our intelligence shows the Americans can field perhaps 2 or 3 divisions by the end of the year. They lack the will for a continental war." Speer scoffed under his breath. "They lack nothing except the time to push the production numbers I have seen. You underestimate them dangerously." Hitler slammed his fist onto the table, rattling coffee cups. "We will strike them before they can strike us," he growled. "A short war, like always. The same miracle that brought us victory in France will save us again." Engel stood behind the row of staff officers, staring down at the production charts in his hands. Numbers that looked harmless alone, but monstrous when compared to Germany's. One American report estimated 60,000 aircraft to be built by the end of the year. Germany could barely manage 12,000. Another projected 8 new fleet carriers, with more laid down every month. Germany had none. Even worse, the United States had begun the largest industrial mobilization the world had ever seen. A transformation already being called the arsenal of democracy. Across America, factories that had once built cars, refrigerators, or typewriters were being refitted overnight. The numbers were staggering. Ford's Willow Run bomber plant was already producing a B-24 Liberator every hour. Kaiser shipyards began launching Liberty ships in under a week. Pittsburgh mills poured rivers of steel that matched the entire Axis output combined. And this was already happening, a month after Hitler declared war. Engel watched Speer push a dossier toward Hitler. "Look at this," Speer said. "American women are joining the labor force. Skilled or not, they can work in factories by the millions. Their workforce will dwarf ours easily." Hitler didn't even glance at it. "Nonsense," he said sharply. "Women cannot build war machines. Leave such fantasies to the democracies." Speer closed the folder slowly, expression tight. He had just realized what many staff officers had only whispered. Hitler would ignore any fact that did not flatter his vision of the war. A messenger burst into the room, breathless. "Radio intercepts from America, sir. Roosevelt has signed the War Powers Act. Their production is accelerating even faster than our estimates." Keitel stiffened. "Then we accelerate ours." "With what steel?" Speer demanded. With what fuel? What rubber? What aluminum? We are stretched to the breaking point. Hitler waved them away like buzzing flies. Production will rise. The people will work harder. They always do. Outside the bunker, a train screeched into the station. Another shipment of wounded from the Eastern Front. Stretcher bearers carried limp bodies through the snow. Engel stepped out to watch, boots sinking into drifts as the wind screamed around him. A medic passed him, face gray with exhaustion. How many survived the retreat from Moscow? Engel asked quietly. Not enough, the medic whispered. And more are lost to the cold than the Russians. Engel looked toward the tree line, where the dark forest faded into a blinding white blur. Germany was bleeding out in the snow, and Hitler was pretending the wounds didn't exist. Back inside, the afternoon briefing turned to the Atlantic. U-boat Admiral. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood before a projected map of convoy lanes. Our submarines are inflicting heavy losses, he declared. If we sink enough American shipping, we can starve them of the supplies they need to influence the war. Engel watched the tiny pins marking sunken Allied vessels. It was impressive, for now. But he also saw the incoming wave of American industrial output that would replace those ships tenfold. Dönitz pointed at a chart. At this pace, we will destroy 6 million tons of Allied shipping this year. Speer replied coldly. And the Americans will build 8 million tons. Dönitz hesitated. The room fell silent. Even Hitler's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt, quickly masked by anger. No, Hitler snapped. America is soft. Its people are undisciplined. They will not fight a long war. But Engel had seen the telegrams from Washington. Roosevelt's fireside speeches were rallying the nation. Draft boards were swelling beyond capacity. American factories had begun operating 7 days a week. The country was waking like a giant stirred from sleep. Hitler didn't realize it, or refused to. As Engel left the meeting, he overheard 2 staff officers whispering near the stairwell. We cannot fight Russia, Britain, and America, one whispered. We aren't fighting America yet, the other replied. The first man shook his head. Oh, but we are. We just don't see them yet. Engel stepped into the freezing courtyard. The sky above the Wolfschanze was dark, choked with storm clouds. Snowflakes whipped across his coat as he stared into the distance. There, far across the Atlantic, lay a nation with endless oil, endless steel, endless manpower. And Germany had just declared war on it. July 1942, Hampton Roads Naval Base, Virginia. Heat shimmered across the dry dock as sparks rained from a dozen welding torches. The noise was deafening. The metallic screech of steel plates being riveted, the roar of cranes hauling massive sections of hull into place, the thunder of engines being tested for the first time. Workers in denim coveralls moved like an army through the haze, sweat dripping from soot-streaked faces. Shipyard foreman Walter Red Connolly wiped his brow and shouted over the din. "Keep it moving. That transport leaves this dock tomorrow morning, even if I have to drag her into the water myself." Nearby, a group of factory reporters scribbled furiously. One asked, "Is it true the president says you've outpaced the Germans already?" A welder overheard and laughed between strikes of his hammer. "Outpaced? Buddy, we're drowning them in steel." Behind Connolly, the hull of a brand new Liberty ship loomed. 441 feet of welded steel, hastily assembled but perfectly functional. Not elegant, not refined, but fast, cheap, and multiplying at a rate Hitler could not comprehend. 6 months earlier, German intelligence had predicted America would need until 1944 to influence the Atlantic. But the reality was this. It was 1942, and the United States was launching one new cargo ship every day. Across the yard, a civilian inspector ran his hands along the weld seams. "Hard to believe," he muttered, "but this whole boat was finished in 4.5 days." Connolly grinned. "We'll do it in 3 next time." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, U-boat captains were discovering the consequences. July 8, 1942, North Atlantic. The ocean was a black, rolling monster beneath U-553. Kapitän Lieutenant Carl Thurman peered through the periscope, scanning the horizon. His eyes widened. There, silhouetted against the moon, a convoy. 30 ships at least. Navy escorts bristling with guns. Thurman lowered the periscope slowly. "It's not possible," he whispered. "There were not this many ships last month." His first officer frowned. "Are we sure? Could they be the same transports returning?" Thurman shook his head. "Returning? Impossible. The Allies would need months to replace their losses. Months we denied them." But he was wrong. The United States was no longer trying to protect the Atlantic. It was trying to fill it. Back in Europe, the shock was growing. August 1942, Reich Chancellery, Berlin. Hitler paced across the marble floor, boots clicking sharply. Keitel and Jodl stood stiffly as General Alfred Jansa laid a stack of intercepted reports on the table. "This," Jansa said quietly, "is the American production forecast for 1943. Hitler snatched the papers. His face reddened as he skimmed through the numbers. 125,000 aircraft, 75,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 18 fleet carriers and escort carriers, 20 million tons of shipping." "Lies," Hitler shouted. "Propaganda." Jansa hesitated. "Mein Führer." These figures were verified by both Abwehr and the Italian naval attaché. The room fell silent. Keitel swallowed hard. "Even if they build half of this, half is enough to overwhelm Europe," Speer finished bluntly. For the first time, Engels saw something in Hitler's face that terrified him more than anger. Uncertainty. Hitler slammed the binder shut. "America is soft. They will break under the weight of their own expectations." "Soft," Speer snapped. "Their factories are running 24 hours a day. Their workers volunteer overtime without pay. Their shipyards are hiring men by the tens of thousands. Their universities are training engineers faster than we can conscript farm boys." Hitler glared at him. "You exaggerate." "I understate," Speer whispered. The room grew cold. September 1942, a field hospital outside Stalingrad. A winter storm hammered the canvas tents. Inside, wounded German soldiers lay on stretchers, shivering as the temperature plunged. Supplies were running low. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was disappearing. A young lieutenant stared at a tattered newspaper left by a medic. The headline read, "America to supply Russia with 50,000 trucks." "Trucks," he muttered. "We barely have enough horses." His voice cracked. "How do you fight an enemy that can replace everything you destroy?" The medic didn't answer. The truth was everywhere. Whispered among the wounded, murmured by staff officers, cursed in mess tents. Germany had awakened a sleeping giant, and the giant was now wide awake. October 1942, Wolf's Lair. Hitler gathered his generals again, eyes burning with fanatic fire. "We will win through willpower," he declared. "We will outfight them. America is large, but we are strong." Nobody responded. Outside, snow fell quietly, a shroud settling over the Eastern Front. Inside, a single thought echoed through the mind of every officer in the room. This war is no longer winnable. It was not yet spoken aloud, but everyone felt it. January 12th, 1943. Casablanca, French Morocco. Wind whipped across the airfield as President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped out of his transport, his face stern beneath the brim of his fedora. Generals Eisenhower and Marshall waited for him, flanked by British officers. Nearby, the hum of generators and the chatter of air crews filled the air. A strange sound for a diplomatic summit, but fitting for the first Allied conference on enemy soil. Inside a commandeered hotel-turned-headquarters, Roosevelt scanned a massive wall map. Red lines marked German-held territories, North Africa, Greece, Norway, most of Eastern Europe. Blue arrows showed Allied plans. "What's our industrial outlook?" FDR asked, without looking up. General Marshall handed him a folder thick with papers. "Sir, the United States will outproduce the Axis 5-1 by year's end." FDR nodded once. No triumph, no boast, only determination. "Then we'll finish what they started." Beside him, Churchill puffed on his cigar and muttered, "This is what Hitler failed to understand. He thought he was awakening an opponent. Instead, he woke a nation. A nation preparing for total war." The Allies agreed that day. Only unconditional surrender was acceptable. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no peace until Germany and Japan were broken. It was the moment Hitler unknowingly signed his own death warrant. Across the world, the consequences of his decision to confront America were becoming painfully clear. February 1943. Ruhr Valley, Germany. Air raid sirens shrieked across Essen as B-17 formations thundered through the clouds. The sky shook with the deep rumble of four-engine bombers, silver shapes glinting in the searchlight beams. Inside the Krupp steelworks, German workers dove for cover. Explosions tore through the facilities, sending fireballs into the night. Blast furnaces collapsed. Machinery warped. A foreman staggered through the smoke, screaming for his men to take shelter. Above the city, Captain Charles Whitman checked his instruments. "Targets hit," he radioed. "But the boys in back say they're still loading for round 2. His co-pilot laughed grimly. "We've got more bombs than they've got factories." It wasn't arrogance. It was fact. American air production had skyrocketed. 48,000 planes in 1942, 85,000 in 1943. Germany could not shoot them down fast enough. The Luftwaffe hemorrhaged trained pilots every month. Replacement aircraft rolled off German production lines slower, weaker, and with fewer experienced men to fly them. For the first time, German commanders admitted privately, "We cannot match this power." March 1943. Wolfsburg, Germany. Inside a darkened bunker, Albert Speer studied new intelligence reports. His hands trembled as he whispered to himself, 85,000 aircraft, 90,000 tanks, 120 aircraft carriers and escort carriers. He felt something like dread crawl up his spine. "We are fighting not one nation," he realized, "but an entire continent filled with factories." A radio operator burst into the room. "Herr Minister, another raid over Hamburg. The fire brigades can't reach half the city. Telegraph lines are down." Speer closed his eyes. "It has begun," he said. "The war of production. The war Hitler never understood." Hitler still believed in morale, in willpower, in spirit. But America believed in tonnage, in output, in overwhelming scale. And numbers, cold, steel-hard, unrelenting numbers, were now crushing the Reich. March 1943. Bismarck Sea, near New Guinea. Tropical heat shimmered over the water as Japanese destroyers zigzagged desperately. Overhead, swarms of American B-25 Mitchells dove low, releasing bombs and strafing runs in deadly precision. On board the destroyer Arashio, Lieutenant Tanaka gripped the railing as another wave of aircraft roared in. "There are too many," a sailor screamed. Tanaka watched helplessly as transport ships exploded one by one. Hundreds of soldiers were thrown into the burning water. The smoke was thick enough to blot out the sun. "Where are our fighters?" someone cried. Tanaka's voice cracked. "They cannot reach this far. The Americans have more planes than we can count." As the last Japanese ship slipped beneath the waves, the lieutenant stared at the horizon. He had heard rumors that America was building planes so fast they could replace every loss in a single week. Now, he believed it. Back in Berlin, the warnings reached Hitler's desk. April 1943. Reich Chancellery. A courier placed a report in front of Hitler. His eyes scanned the first page, then hardened. Total U.S. war production projected. 100,000 planes, 50,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. Enough ammunition to supply 5 simultaneous fronts. Hitler slammed his fist against the table. "Impossible! Fantasy!" he shouted. But General Jodl shook his head. "Mein Führer, we have verified the data. America is producing more than the rest of the world combined." Hitler's face contorted. "They are soft. They will break." Silence. Every officer in the room knew the truth. America wasn't breaking. America was accelerating, fueled by anger, fueled by industry, fueled by a nation united in purpose. And Hitler, in a single reckless moment on December 11th, 1941, had chosen to fight that nation. One general whispered to another, "He opened the gates of hell, and now hell is marching toward Berlin." They were right. July 10th, 1943. Sicily, Mediterranean Sea. The night sky over the Sicilian coast glowed orange as naval guns lit up the darkness. From the deck of the American transport ship, Samuel Chase, Corporal James Donnelly stared at the hellish shoreline where German and Italian defenses fired blindly into the sea. The waves churned with landing craft. Engines roared, boots thudded on steel, officers shouted orders through the deafening thunder of the barrage. A British major beside him muttered, "Good God, you Yanks brought the whole continent with you." Donnelly laughed nervously. "Sir, this is just the first wave." Across the Mediterranean horizon, the silhouettes of hundreds of ships crowded the sea. Cruisers, destroyers, battleships, and landing craft, stretching so far that the coastline's curvatures swallowed them. Overhead swarms of C-47s droned like a storm cloud, towing gliders and dropping paratroopers into the black. Axis troops on the beach stared in disbelief. One Italian lieutenant blinked through his binoculars. "Madonna, that must be the entire U.S. Navy." His German counterpart shook his head slowly. "No, this is only part of one fleet." For the first time, frontline Axis soldiers witnessed what their leaders never feared. The United States arriving in strength, not one division at a time, but as an avalanche. September 1943. Berlin, Germany. Inside a concrete bunker lit by sputtering lamps, the echoes of typewriters filled the stale air. Intelligence officers hunched over intercepted Allied broadcasts, train convoy reports, and factory output summaries. Colonel Kurt Zeitzler rubbed his temples as another report was placed on his desk. American armor production, 1943. Sherman tanks delivered, 29,000 TDs and support vehicles, 14,000. He exhaled sharply. We destroy 100 tanks. They send 200 more. A young officer spoke hesitantly. Herr Oberst, some of the men say, America fights like it doesn't fear losses. Zeitzler stared at him. Because they don't fear losses, they replace them. He gestured toward a map on the wall. Red pins marked German divisions still fighting on the Eastern Front, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic Wall. Blue pins, American divisions, were multiplying by the week. Hitler thought they were a nation of merchants and movie stars, Zeitzler said bitterly. But they have built an army from steel. November 1943. Kassel, Germany. The night was torn open by the droning thunder of thousands of engines. German civilians staggered through streets lit by fires and anti-aircraft bursts. Above the city, the sky seemed alive. Hundreds of B-17s and Lancasters flying in disciplined formation, each bomber releasing its payload with terrifying precision. Frau Margot Eberhardt clutched her son's hand as the ground shook violently. "This cannot be real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No one country can send this many planes." But the planes kept coming, wave after wave. Hours passed. By dawn, Kassel was a smoldering shell. Entire districts erased. German firefighters wept as they battled flames with too little water and too few men. A Luftwaffe captain looked up at the distant contrails and whispered, "It is as if America has factories in the sky." Even hardened soldiers began to understand. Germany was no longer fighting enemies on battlefields. It was drowning beneath an enemy it had summoned, one it could not equal. January 1944. Washington, D.C. War Production Board. Clocks ticked loudly on the walls as engineers, businessmen, and military officials examined blueprints for new ships and tanks. "Gentlemen," the chairman announced, "we are ahead of schedule." A general raised an eyebrow. "Ahead? How far ahead?" "Liberty ship number 2445 just launched. Tank production exceeding requirements. Aircraft output will reach 100,000 this year." The room fell silent. "And next year?" another officer asked. The chairman smiled slightly. "Next year, even higher." On a chalkboard behind him, the numbers were staggering. 24-hour shipyards, aircraft plants running 3 shifts, steel production unmatched by any nation in history. It was a war machine powered by an entire society: farmers, welders, machinists, women with rivet guns, high school boys pushing steel on night shifts. You could hear the war being built before you could hear it being fought. March 6, 1944. Over Berlin. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin and frigid. The P-51 Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group streaked past the bombers they were escorting. Lieutenant Chuck Yeager scanned the sky, his gloved hand resting on the stick. He spotted them first. Dark specks above the sun. F-90s diving fast. "Bogies, 12 o'clock high," he barked into his radio. Mustangs peeled off with stunning coordination. Tracers filled the sky. German pilots, outnumbered and exhausted, broke formation. Their radios crackled with panic. "Himmel! Even over Berlin, they escort their bombers now?" Another pilot cried, "Where do they find so many planes?" Yeager rolled his aircraft into a tight turn, flames reflecting across his canopy as a 190 exploded in front of him. "You boys picked the wrong fight," he muttered. High above the burning city, German pilots felt it. The crushing weight of a new reality. The Americans weren't just here. They were everywhere. Across Europe, whispers spread through German ranks. Hitler has brought the Americans into the war, and now we fight the whole world. He opened the gates of hell. By spring 1944, even Hitler's most loyal commanders knew the truth. America's entry into the war wasn't just a strategic mistake. It was the single most catastrophic decision Hitler ever made. He had declared war on a nation he didn't understand. A nation of factories, not fortresses. A nation of workers, not warriors. A nation that fought with numbers, with engines, with speed. And would not stop until Germany was ashes. June 6, 1944. Normandy coast, France. Dawn broke with a low, trembling rumble. Not thunder, but artillery. The sky over the English Channel was gray and cold. Yet the sea below churned with life. Landing craft, destroyers, battleships, transports, all converging on France in a living, moving tide of steel. From the cliffs above Omaha Beach, Obergefreiter Hans Keller squinted through his binoculars. What he saw made his breath catch. A horizon made of ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. "You're seeing things," muttered the machine gunner beside him. Keller didn't blink. "No," he whispered. "We're seeing America." The naval guns opened up, each one shaking the earth beneath his boots. Landing ramps crashed into the waves as soldiers poured into the surf. Americans, British, Canadians, in numbers that defied comprehension. The German defenders fought with ferocity, but waves of troops kept coming. Engineers blew gaps in defenses. Tanks rolled off amphibious craft. Naval shells smashed fortifications that had stood for years. In the chaos, Keller yelled to his sergeant, "How can we stop them?" The sergeant fired another burst and spat. "We can't." On that single day, America committed more troops, ships, vehicles, and aircraft than Germany could hope to replace in a year. This was no longer a war Germany could win. This was a reckoning it had created with its own arrogance. July 1944. Eastern Front, Poland. The ground shook like an earthquake as Soviet T-34s surged forward, hundreds of them, supported by American-made Studebaker trucks carrying infantry, ammunition, and fuel. U.S. Lend-Lease aircraft roared overhead, engines whining. A German Feldwebel watched in disbelief as the Soviet offensive smashed through thin defensive lines. "Why do they have so many trucks?" one of his men gasped. "American trucks," the Feldwebel said bitterly. The men stared as entire Soviet divisions moved with the speed of mechanized thunder. Gone were the days of horse-drawn supply carts. Now, the Red Army could move faster than Germany could retreat. A single phrase spread through the German ranks. "The Americans are fighting us from the east, too." Hitler had not just brought the United States into the war. He had supercharged his most dangerous enemy. September 1944, Ruhr Valley, Germany. Smoke from burning factories curled into the sky as civilians evacuated what had once been the industrial heart of the Reich. Anti-aircraft crews scanned the sky helplessly. Then the droning began, a low, heavy hum like distant thunder. A boy looked up. "Mama, what is that sound?" Her voice broke. "It's them. Again." Bombers, hundreds of them. B-17s and B-24s escorted by long-range Mustangs. The sky was a grid of silver wings and contrails. Flak burst all around them, black puffs in a vast gray sky, but the formations barely shifted. Inside one of the command bunkers, General Alfred Jodl slammed his fist into the table. "We are fighting an enemy who manufactures airplanes faster than we shoot them down." A staff officer added quietly, "And fuel and tanks and uniforms and ammunition." Jodl cut him off. "Hitler has doomed us. When he declared war on America, he signed our death warrant." Outside, the bombers dropped their payloads. The earth convulsed as steel mills, refineries, and munitions plants exploded. Germany had once dreamed of conquering continents. Now it struggled to protect its own smokestacks. December 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The forest was quiet under a blanket of snow. German troops of the 6th Panzer Army huddled around campfires, rubbing their hands for warmth. Their commander, General Sepp Dietrich, surveyed a map illuminated by lantern light. "This is our last chance," he told his officers. "We strike fast, break through the American lines, reach Antwerp, and split their armies in two." The plan, the Ardennes offensive, depended on one assumption: that American troops would break under pressure, that America was soft, that its soldiers lacked resolve. At dawn, German armor punched through the fog. Tiger tanks smashed aside American outposts. Captured GIs marched past German officers, hands raised, faces pale. Dietrich's officers grinned. "They're running." For 48 hours, it seemed Hitler's gamble might work. Then the fog lifted, and the full force of the American military answered. Columns of Sherman tanks, entire battalions at a time, thundered toward the front. Fresh infantry divisions arrived by the hour. Convoys of trucks, more trucks than Germany could manufacture in a year, poured into the Ardennes. One German officer stared at the endless columns and whispered, "Where do they get all this?" Another replied hoarsely, "From the factories we said they didn't have." P-47. Thunderbolts screamed overhead, bombing roads and armor. The sky, which the Luftwaffe once dominated, now belonged entirely to America. Within weeks, the German offensive shattered. The Battle of the Bulge became Germany's final strategic failure, crushed not by strategy, not by numbers alone, but by America's inexhaustible strength. February 1945. Berlin Chancellery. Hitler sat hunched over his map table, hands shaking, eyes bloodshot. Reports from every front lay scattered before him. Soviet breakthroughs, Allied bombings, collapsing armies, starving civilians. A messenger entered the bunker quietly. "Mein Führer, the Americans have crossed the Rhine." Hitler didn't react immediately. Then he laughed, a hoarse, broken sound. "It was a mistake," he muttered. "A stupid, stupid mistake." He stared at the ceiling. "I opened the gates of hell," he whispered. His words echoed through the bunker. Even his loyal officers no longer denied the truth. Germany had lost the war the moment it declared war on the United States. Not because of ideology, not because of strategy, but because Hitler had awakened a giant. One with endless factories, endless energy, endless resolve. The giant he mocked. The giant he never understood. The giant that would bury him. April 12th, 1945. Elbe River, near Torgau, Germany. Mist clung to the riverbanks as the sun rose over a landscape reduced to rubble. Burned-out farmhouses, shattered bridges, craters filled with rainwater. The death throes of a crumbling Reich. Along the muddy road leading to the Elbe, American infantry from the 69th Division marched cautiously, rifles at the ready. Private Samuel Lasky brushed the dust from his helmet and stared at the horizon. In the distance, a column of tanks, Soviet T-34s, crested a hill, their silhouettes stark against the pale sky. He blinked. "Jesus," he whispered. "They're really here." For years, German propaganda had bragged that they were holding the world at bay, that Europe was theirs, that Moscow had fallen, that America was too far away, too weak, too divided. Now the truth rolled toward Torgau on steel tracks. The Red Army, the U.S. Army, two colossi meeting in the heart of Germany. The war Hitler dreamed would divide his enemies had instead united them against him. As the first Soviet tank rumbled close, its driver stood from the hatch and waved. An American lieutenant stepped forward, raising his hand in greeting. Cameras clicked. Soldiers cheered. The war was not over, but everyone could feel it. The end had come into view. Thousands of miles away, Hitler raged in his bunker beneath Berlin. April 16th, 1945. Berlin, Führerbunker. The ground trembled. Dust drifted from the concrete ceiling. The roar of Soviet artillery, over 1 million shells fired in the opening barrage, echoed through the underground corridors. Hitler's generals huddled over a map that showed little but red arrows pushing in from all directions. General Alfred Jodl cleared his throat. Mein Führer. The Americans have reached Nuremberg. Patton's Third Army is moving north. The Ruhr is surrounded. Our industry is gone. Hitler's face twitched. No. No. America is weak, decadent. They do not have the will. Jodl exchanged a glance with Keitel, then said quietly, they have the resources and the will. A messenger burst through the door, out of breath. Soviet forces have crossed the Oder in multiple sectors. They have massed 10,000 artillery pieces. They are... Hitler cut him off, slamming his fist into the table. No more reports, I won't hear it. But the truth roared above them with every artillery blast. This was the judgment brought by the nation he had mocked, the nation he believed would never fight. April 21st, 1945. Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin. The once grand airfield was now a wasteland of twisted aircraft and burning hangars. The Luftwaffe, once feared, once the envy of Europe, was reduced to a handful of desperate pilots flying worn-out fighters with barely enough fuel to circle the city. Major Heinrich Ernst stood beside the wreck of a Messerschmitt Bf-109, its fuselage peppered with shrapnel. A mechanic tossed his wrench aside in frustration. We can't fix it, the man said, not without parts. And the trains don't run anymore. Ernst stared at the ruins of Tempelhof, the smoke drifting across the cracked tarmac. In the distance, the ground shook again. American artillery. We brought this on ourselves, he murmured. He remembered the early days of the war, the parades, the triumphs, the belief that Germany was invincible. Now, the factories that powered those dreams lay in ruins. The refineries were ash. The railways were twisted metal. Not even the tanks rolling toward Berlin could be fueled anymore. Germany had been crushed not only by armies, but by an industrial hurricane. A hurricane Hitler had unleashed upon himself. April 25th, 1945. Potsdamer Platz, Berlin. The smell of burning rubber and brick dust hung thick in the air. Civilians huddled in subway tunnels, listening to the echo of tank cannons and the rattle of machine gun fire above. Children clung to their mothers. Old men whispered prayers. On the surface, SS units fought block by block, firing Panzerfausts from shattered windows. Soviet infantry advanced through clouds of smoke, supported by roaring flamethrower tanks. American bombers, long-range Mustangs circling overhead, hammered rail yards and command posts. This was the final collapse of Hitler's delusions. Among the rubble, a German officer named Captain Dietrich Weber dragged himself behind a wrecked tramcar, his uniform torn, his face streaked with blood and soot. He looked up in time to see a column of Sherman tanks rumble past. Not American, but Soviet Lend-Lease Shermans painted red. His eyes widened. They're everywhere, he whispered. America's industry had fueled the very army now crushing Berlin. Trucks, radios, boots, ammunition, much of it stamped "Made in USA." Hitler had declared war on one enemy. He ended up empowering two. April 30th, 1945. Führer Bunker, Berlin. The bunker was silent except for distant explosions. Hitler sat alone in his dimly lit room, hands trembling, eyes hollow. His empire was gone. His cities destroyed. His armies scattered. His dreams of conquest buried beneath the rubble of Berlin. He whispered the truth aloud, words he had never dared to say in public. I should never have challenged America. It was not a strategic admission. It was a confession. He had mocked the United States as soft. He had laughed at its democracy, its diversity, its decadent capitalism. He had believed its factories could not match his armies. But America had done what Germany could not imagine. It turned its entire nation into a war machine. The lights flickered. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Hitler reached for his pistol. Outside, the Soviet flag rose above the Reichstag. May 8th, 1945. Berlin, Germany. VE Day. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers marched through the ruins of German cities. Whole neighborhoods lay flattened, smoke drifting between shattered walls. Children approached cautiously, asking for chocolate. German prisoners lined the roads, exhausted, confused, afraid. One U.S. corporal stared up at the wreckage of the Reich Chancellery and said softly, "This is what happens when a madman thinks he can take on the world." His sergeant replied, "Not the world, just us. We were enough." In Nuremberg, Admiral Karl Dönitz received the news of surrender with cold resignation. He had once commanded the U-boats that nearly strangled Britain. Now he signed documents at a folding table in a schoolhouse. The day Hitler declared war on the United States, Dönitz said quietly, was the day Germany sealed its fate. Epilogue. The judgment of history. Hitler's decision was not strategic, not rational, not calculated. It was ideological, emotional, suicidal. In December 1941, he unleashed a power he did not understand. A nation that could rebuild aircraft carriers in 3 days, construct tens of thousands of planes and tanks, and train millions of soldiers half a world away. He declared war on industry. He declared war on resources. He declared war on innovation. He declared war on a people who, when provoked, united with terrifying speed and strength. He declared war on America, and in doing so, as one German general later wrote, Hitler did not just open the gates of hell, he walked through them.